Good evening and welcome back to this consideration of what it will mean for us to handle the faith, what is catechism, what is learning, teaching, being instructed in the faith in this challenging time. And last week I began by sharing with you some notions about that. We're going to talk about several different practices and disciplines of the Christian faith, but essentially as we help a new generation to enter into the drama that is the Christian life, and I say drama rather than learning all the ideas of the Christian faith. The Christian faith has been impoverished in our current moment. It has been turned into three sort of caricatures of its reality, and one of those being an experiential caricature, and we see this in some of the excesses of the charismatic movement and in some of the megachurches that emphasize a kind of conjured emotion that you can create by certain music or certain kinds of things that are not the same thing as the deeper sense of that transforming reality of Christian life. Now that doesn't mean that they're not doing good and valid things. It doesn't mean that God is not using those things, but what it does mean is there is a temptation for us to substitute a kind of human created emotional experience for the divine drama. We want to help our children, we want to help the next generation to experience that deeper reality. And that's the question that we're asking, is how do we help them in that journey? And so we talked about some things that are part of our practices. And in the old years, there was a kind of a question and answer thing. And question and answer is a time-honored way to push the mind and the heart to engage material. But there is a danger of a second caricature, and that second caricature would be to intellectualize the faith. And so we see people who are obsessed with apologetics and arguing sort of why Christianity is so compelling that people have to be persuaded of it. And if we can just present all this evidence, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, then only an idiot would not be a Christian. And the truth is, the will does not generate strictly out of rational kinds of things. And some of the rational arguments that people make about Christianity are not really as rational as they want to present it. They have read a few books and they are convinced by that, and they just don't understand why anybody else wouldn't understand it. But to truly comprehend the faith is much deeper than that. And so that's sort of our second caricature. The third one is the worst and most dangerous of all, and that is it has been shrunk down to moral and political positions, cultural arguments, and trying to sort of preserve a way of life, so that today Christianity in the United States of America, in the minds of many unbelievers, is just a political group, and they really don't see Christ because of our politics. Now that doesn't mean we don't get involved in moral issues, but much of the way we have gone about it has had more to do with the world than it has Jesus. In the methodologies, in our over-identification with certain kinds of extreme positions, and in our failure to add other areas of depth, so that you would want a faith that involves the emotional dimension of life and experiential and the intellectual and right-minded political and moral engagement with the culture, but knowing that none of those by themselves is the Christian faith. So Osmer, in an article we mentioned last time, said that then we have to really begin to think about this as involving three areas, or four. One of these being praxis, or the practice of faith, worship, and praying and witnessing, doing mission. Things in which we live out our faith is one of those. And the second one being doxology, praise, the engagement of our lives with prayer and worship. And the third one being therapeutics, or undertaking the deep inward journey of depth. Many years ago, James Fowler talked about the fact that there are 6 stages that correspond to sort of developmental stages in life. And one of the things that was interesting to me about that is that he said, you know, the third stage is kind of adolescent. It's one in which we, he called it conventional, but this is when a lot of people are converted as teenagers. They make life claims for Christ, and it's a good thing. The thinking of adolescence is black and white thinking, and sometimes it takes black and white thinking, especially, you know, if you're caught in addiction and you say, I've got to quit this or I'm going to die, or I need to decide for Christ or my life is going to continue the way it is. But that is not adequate for everything in life, and there are things that become gray and more complex later on. So all of these things are they're very challenging for us. And so as we think about that, catechism is more than just one of these dimensions. It really is a relationship between teacher and learner. And it's a relationship that is spiritual because God is engaged in that too. So you and I are just not looking for information about being a Christian, learning certain facts, or learning the books of the Bible, or learning the biblical story even, but it is a bigger thing where we are socialized. You know, when I was in the Boy Scouts many years ago, you are socialized into the Boy Scouts. You go on hikes and you camp out and you learn to canoe and you learn how to swim and you do all these things that are part of being a scout. And you know, I remember that brief time that I was in the Scouts as being just very, very transformative. Well, church is really like that too. It's by doing church. It's by being around church people. It's by learning from Christians and talking with Christians. So everything we do is part of the drama, and so we should know that everything we do in the church is about teaching the faith in one way or another. It's kind of a drama workshop where we come and learn this story. The fact that we've reduced it to intellectual agreement, or to coming and having a little emotional high every now and then, or agreeing with all the right politics, means that we really have damaged the wholeness of the Christian faith. So this is real important. And we look at a couple of things that are dramatic that we have. Baptism, it symbolizes the death and burial and resurrection of Christ. Baptists do it in a very dramatic way. We put people under the water and bring them back up again. But it's a following Christ in baptism and death and resurrection again. It is identifying with Him. It is confessing our need of Him. It is bearing witness that we go where He goes. And to reduce that to say, well, it's just a symbol, it doesn't matter that much. Oh, nothing could be more wrong. We've created a kind of minimalism about Lord's Supper and baptism in the Baptist churches sometimes that doesn't understand that Christ is with us decisively in these actions, and by doing these actions, we go with. Now, all of this has the implication of asking us to commit our time to what God is doing. In other words, you invest by being a part of things. One of the challenges of this moment is that it is easy for us to reduce worship down to a few moments in front of a screen and forget that it involves regular prayer, it involves Bible reading, it involves all sorts of things. And I want to tell you about something that I've just sort of started doing when we record the service and when I watch it again at home. I stand on the doxology. It looks kind of silly in a way because there I am standing up in front of my recliner, but I have just chosen to do that every time we do it, to remember my faith in a time when I'm so disconnected from my church. What is something that you do to put the worship of God and the prayer life that you have into your body, into your habits, into the things that you do? And I've been thinking about that a lot, and I see a lot of habits of mine that have suffered, not just from this, but even before this, of just letting some things go that are really, really important. And so our practices are extraordinarily important. And so I wanted to call attention to an article that was done down at Baylor University. They did a study of university students. Dr. Jeter Basden, who is a friend of mine, did a study of students that came to Baylor who were interested in vocational Christian ministry. And I want to tell you some things they found out in this study. Over a 10-year period in the 1990s, they looked at 868 students certified for ministry, and they got a testimony of their call, and they looked at about a fourth of those and analyzed things that influenced a call to ministry. And there were several things there. The top two factors were, did they have private Bible study and prayer present in their life? 43% did. Did they have opportunities for being involved in lay ministry experience in their congregation? 38%. The third most was the influence of Christian parents and a Christian home. When those things are present, God's call tends to manifest very powerfully, because those are instruments through which God calls us into things, which says what you're doing at your house is all as much as important as what we are doing up here at the church together. That Christian parents involve their children in the lives and ministry of the church, or they don't. It's their opportunity to hear the gospel, to respond to it, to participate in ministry. And you know, when they go and feed homeless people, or when they go on a trip somewhere to help people who are different from them, when they get engaged in something right here at their own church, when they participate in worship, all of these things are part of leading up to God's deeper calling in their life. And another thing the study kind of concluded was that Christian parents who are open to God's direction and purpose in the lives of their children will tend to encourage them when they have these senses of calling. And they are, Christian homes, he said, are the instruments for transmission of spiritual values from generation to generation. So the implication of that is that churches need to be intentional to help families stay strong. That's a big task. There's a lot of challenge there. And we need opportunities for families to do things together in ministry, so they experience that. But the third one was this, that he said, encourage the sharing of spiritual journeys. And this brings us to a spiritual practice called testimony. In our church, through the years, we have emphasized a lot that people can share their testimony. Now, the testimony is not about how wonderful you are, or how your life is just so full of blessings, or any of those kinds of things, but it is, where have I seen God at work in my life in ways that surprised me, or uplifted me, or guided me? And those stories are very powerful. When our deacons come every year and share a testimony, we usually send them a document that are sort of testimony starters, and I send it to them because, first of all, it's a terrible panic when you are asked to tell something about your spiritual life, because nobody feels comfortable with that. But one day I sat down and I started writing down, what are the kinds of things people talk about in testimony? And I had things like, what is a Bible verse that's really inspired your life? Or how has your life changed in some way because of God being present in it? Or who influenced your life that made a difference in your spiritual journey? And being comfortable talking about all those things leads us into stories and sharing. One of the questions I always have for you who are at home is, um, do you share your spiritual journey with your children? Are you comfortable doing that? Are you able to talk about your own faith in a natural way? I don't mean all this piety stuff you go down and buy from the bookstore. There's so much nonsense in that that I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying, where did you learn the faith? What are the stories about how something really spoke to your heart? How do you explain what it means to be a Christian when your child asks? Those things are very powerful. What scriptures have shaped your life? And if none have, better start reading. Those things are very, very powerful. And sometimes you even tell stories about how unexpectedly God might have worked in your life. As I conclude today with this part, I'd just like to share you a story. This happened when I was in South Georgia at a time when God was working in many different ways when I was pastor in that church. And we had a friend who was the chaplain at the big hospital down in Lakeland, Florida. She was a single woman, and she drove all the way up there in her car, which was not a young car. It was not in great shape, and she came and stayed with us a few days. We had a wonderful time. We went to seminary together. We went to college together. We had a long friendship, and so when she got ready to leave, I happened to glance down at her old car, and it had a lot of miles, and the tires looked a little thin to me. Just be careful, I said. And for some reason, you know how you just talk sometimes without thinking, I said, if you have car trouble near Moultrie, Georgia, which was down in the country, there was a lot of open country between the town where we were and when she finally got on that big interstate. I said, if you have trouble near Moultrie, I have a friend whose name is Julian. He's at the First Baptist Church. I said it to sort of reassure her. It sounded kind of silly when I said it. And, didn't think about it anymore. A few days later, I get a phone call from my friend, and she says, you know what? When I was on the way home, my car broke down. And it broke down right next to the city limits sign of Moultrie, Georgia. I just couldn't believe it. And so I said, well, what happened? And she said, well, this fella came along in a pickup truck, and he said, let me help you, ma'am. And they got me down to a mechanic. And I said, do you know Julian? And they called the pastor's name. They said, oh, yeah, we know him well. They do things down here all the time. And they said, we'll call him. And so they called, and he came and put her up for the night, gave her breakfast the next morning. They got her car fixed for her, and they wouldn't take any money for it, and she was on her way. And it was an extraordinary thing that I said such a silly little thing. If you have car trouble near Moultrie, I have a friend whose name is Julian. I thought about that a long time, and I thought, that was about the same time that the former Yugoslavia was falling apart, and they had just shelled a marketplace in Sarajevo and wounded a woman who was grieving in a cemetery, and lots of children were killed in that shelling. And I thought, well, God, how is it that you're watching over this one single woman driving through the country here, and yet all that terrible stuff happens? But then I thought, maybe it's just that we so often just don't listen, because God is directing, God is pleading, God is speaking. Maybe not here and there miraculously, but all the time, and mostly unheard. Theoretically, I believe in providence, but only now and then does it get my attention. But man, it got my attention, because Julian happened to be home when she called, and this Pentecostal mechanic gave her the money and took her in. And so in this world full of weird things, every now and then we learn that God is at work. I share that story not to tell you how in tune I am, because I had no idea. It's not like I can look at you mystically and say, this is going to happen or that is going to happen, but I blurted it out just kind of from nowhere. But it says to me that God's Spirit is working, and one of the things, I guess, in sharing that story, I always want to encourage people with is to say, look for God in your life, because God is at work in your life, and sometimes even in ways you don't know. And you can trust that even if you don't always know exactly how it works.